Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Start a Xamarin App from Scratch. My name is Aaron Melamed. I am a Product Solutions Engineer at Syncfusion and your presenter for today's webinar. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the questions box on the right side of the screen at any time. While we will not be answering the questions live today, we will send a link to our blog post to all registrants as soon as it is posted. So please post any questions you have throughout this webinar. This and previous webinars will be available on our YouTube channel. And without further ado, let's go ahead and start the presentation. Okay, so for today's webinar, I decided to do something a little bit different. On the last webinar that I did, I noticed that we got a lot of requests to start a project from scratch. A lot of our viewers wanted to see the entire process of creating an application, not just having a ready-made application and then adding some Syncfusion controls to it. So with today's webinar, that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a project from scratch. I'm going to show you how to embed the Syncfusion controls into it, how to download them, and then of course how to use them and create at least a starter template for a much larger application. So to begin, we're here in Visual Studio. So because we are doing this from scratch, there won't be any code to share. You'll be able to follow along and essentially write the same code that I do. So to begin, you'll want to have Visual Studio open. And from here, we're going to go ahead and create a new project. Since we're focusing on Xamarin today, I am going to go ahead and create a brand new Xamarin project. So this is found under the Visual C# section, and then underneath the cross-platform category underneath that. It'll be the first option, the mobile app under Xamarin.Forms. In this case, I'm going to leave the name at the default. I want to keep it short since I do have other projects with longer names, and that can cause issues. If you've ever worked with Xamarin before, you might know that long project names can cause issues. So I'm just going to leave it at app1 for now. But of course, you can change yours to whatever you'd like. So I'll go ahead and create this project. Now next up is the project template. So we're going to create a blank app. We're not going to use the master detail template since we are going to be using the Syncfusion navigation drawer control, and that will kind of take the place of that master detail template. For platforms, you can choose any combination of platforms that you'd like. For this presentation, I'm only going to focus on Android and iOS. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck UWP, although I normally do leave UWP active. And then third, for the code sharing strategy, we're going to select .NET Standard. .NET Standard is what has replaced the old PCL libraries. So .NET Standard makes it easier to have shared base class libraries that are platform agnostic, which was not true with PCLs. As far as going deeper into the differences, I would leave that up to you. You can. Microsoft has made several posts on the differences and advantages of .NET Standard over the old PCL sharing strategy. So I definitely recommend reading their various blogs on the subject. But all we need to know for now is that we are going to be using .NET Standard, and this is going to be .NET Standard 2.0. So once you've made those choices, go ahead and click OK. And then at this point, Visual Studio will go through the motions and create and set up our solution with the two projects that I selected. If you chose all three, you'll get 3 projects in your solution. So at this point, it's loaded, but it is still actually doing some work in the background. So while that's happening, I'm going to pull up my browser, and I'm going to direct you to the help.syncfusion.com website. So this is the Syncfusion online documentation, which again is help.syncfusion.com. And we're actually going to be using this quite a bit throughout the presentation. So I'm going to go to the Xamarin.Forms section of the documentation. We are going to be creating a Xamarin.Forms application. And from here, we're going to be utilizing a lot of the documentation for the 2 controls that we're going to be showing today, the navigation drawer and the list view. So hopefully by this point, Visual Studio is done. Looks like it is not. So we'll just give that a second. Okay. Looks like at this point it is finished. Or not, still waiting. All right, so while that is still doing something, what we're actually going to start doing, I'm actually going to point you to the correct place that we're going to start in the documentation. So when we get the project up and running, the first thing we're going to want to do is actually download and install the Syncfusion assemblies. There are 2 ways we can access the Syncfusion controls. If you have a free trial or if you have a license with Syncfusion, whether it's community or any of the other licenses, and you have access to our Xamarin.Forms controls, you can just log into syncfusion.com, go to your account, and download the product, either the Essential Studio or the specific Xamarin controls themselves. Otherwise, If you would rather not reference the assemblies locally, we can also go to the download and installation section in the documentation, go to your preferred platform of choice, whether it be Mac or Windows, and then from here, we can find the installation instructions for configuring NuGet. And that's actually what I'm going to be using. I'm going to be pulling these packages from our NuGet feed. So if you would like to go ahead and set that up, just go ahead and follow these instructions. Let's check back on Visual Studio. All right, so now it looks like we're ready to go. So like I said, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and install or configure the packages that I'm going to be using for this project. So I'm going to right-click on my solution, and let me just do that one more time. I'm going to right-click on the solution and go to Manage NuGet Packages for the solution. Now, because I've actually done this before, you'll notice that if I go to Package Source here in the top right, I do have a Syncfusion Xamarin NuGet feed here already available. So if you were to follow the instructions on the web page that I just showed you, it would tell you to go here, click on the gear icon, which will take you to your Package Sources settings page, where you can add a new package source. So you'll be asked for the URL, and you'll ask to be given, or you'll be asked to give that URL a name, so you know what controls are coming from that feed. So all of that can be found in documentation. So depending on whether on Mac or Windows, you'll get the NuGet feed. So here's the one for Xamarin. You'll plug that into your Visual Studio, and then just give it a name. I gave mine the name of Syncfusion Xamarin. And I specifically called it Syncfusion Xamarin and not just Syncfusion, since we do have different NuGet feeds for different platforms. So you can see down here I have one that's disabled called Syncfusion MVC. So this is for our ASP.NET MVC controls. Obviously I want to keep those separate. I want to know what they are. So if you are creating a name for it, make sure it is specific enough in case you do use other Syncfusion controls and you also get those from NuGet. Okay, so with that out of the way, then now what we can do is switch our package source over to NuGet, or sorry, to Syncfusion Xamarin, or to all if you'd rather do it that way. But it's quicker if you just specify the Xamarin Syncfusion feed. And then from there, we're going to browse those controls and find the two that we're going to be working with today. So the first one is the navigation drawer. So let's just type in navigation. In here, it'll search. We'll come up with a couple. Whenever you find the navigation drawer, you'll notice that there are 3 different versions. There's navigation drawer, then there's navigation drawer Android and iOS. Since we're working with since we're working with Xamarin.Forms, we'll want to stick with the one that just says SF navigation drawer. Also, if you read the instructions, it will tell you that you do need to install it to all projects in the solution. So just go ahead and click the project checkbox, and that'll select everything. And then just make sure to install the latest stable version. When you click install, it will ask you to accept the license, so go ahead and accept those. And then just wait a few seconds for the packages to install. So you can monitor the output window down here, and it'll let you know when everything is finished. All right, looks like it's done. So next up, we're also going to include or install the list view. So let's go ahead and type in list view. And there we go. So we have one component for that. And because I've already installed the navigation drawer, my project checkbox is already checked for me. So all I need to do is make sure I'm installing the latest stable version and then click install. Once again, we want to accept the license agreements. Go ahead and do that. And hopefully my output will actually automatically scroll to let me know when everything is done this time. All right, so now that is finished as well. So at this point, we are ready to begin. So we've installed the components into our project, and now we're ready to actually write some code. So I'm going to close out that tab. I don't need that for now. And now the first thing I'm going to do in this application, my shared project, is I'm going to add a new folder, or actually a couple of folders. So the first one I'm going to add is view. We are going to be adhering at least somewhat to the MVVM design pattern. So I'm going to create a view folder. I'm also going to go ahead and create a view model folder. For now, I'm not going to create a model folder. I'll do that later. So these are the only two we need at this moment. The next thing I'm going to do, since I do want to follow MVVM, is I'm going to move the default main page that's created with the project, I'm just going to move that into the view folder. So I'm just going to drag it in there. And because I have dragged that in there manually, I do need to update some references here. So I need to add .view to the class in the XAML. I also need to do the same thing for the namespace and the code behind. There we go. So in the code behind, I need to update the namespace to include .view. Save that. I also need to save the XAML, and that will get rid of this red squiggle in just a moment. There we go. All right. Next thing I need to do is, just so I don't forget later, I need to go ahead and update my app.xaml.cs as well, since it is currently looking to load the main page from the root, the project root. I want to load that from that view folder. All right, so I'll save that as well and close that. So now we are actually ready to begin. So the first thing I need to do in order to get my first component in here is I need to go back to the documentation. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the navigation drawer. That's the main component that's going to be on this main page, since I do want, of course, to have a menu in order to toggle between pages inside my application. So I need to go to the documentation because if you go into here and go down to navigation drawer, you'll notice that for essentially all of the controls that we have here, there is a section titled Getting Started. Whenever you're dealing with these Xamarin controls, you want to make sure you check out the Getting Started page, since a lot of times there'll be some important information you need to know in order to properly configure these components. As an example, you can see right at top there are some additional steps for iOS that need to be done in order for this control to render properly in that platform. So in this case, I know that I need to copy this line right here, and I need to copy or paste that into my app delegate file. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio, open my iOS project, go down to my app delegate, and paste that line of code right above that global Xamarin.Forms line. All right, so that takes care of that. So now I can save that in my app delegate and move back over to main page.xaml. The next thing I need to do is pay attention to this. There's another additional step for UWP. I am not using UWP in this particular project, so I can skip this. And then next, I need to initialize the navigation drawer. In order to do that in the XAML, I need to first create a namespace in order to call the appropriate assembly. So in order to make sure that happens, I'm going to copy this line here, just the part that's in the brackets, which is essentially the namespace we need in order to call the assembly. So I've copied that, so now I'm going to move back over to the main page, and I'm going to paste that in. So now we have this namespace called navigation drawer, and we can use that to call up our navigation drawer. So I'm going to replace this label here with that. So this will be navigation drawer. Inside of that will be the Syncfusion navigation drawer. The first thing I'm going to need to do is just give it a name. And in this case, I'll call it nav drawer. The next thing I know I need to do, because I've read ahead in the documentation, is I need to give the drawer itself a width, so that whenever I slide out my menu, it slides out at an appropriate size. So the documentation recommends about 200 pixels, and I know for the project that or the menu items that I'm going to have in my particular menu, I only need about 150 pixels worth of space in order to make everything fit. And that is essentially it for now. So I can go ahead and close out my navigation drawer tag there. And now the next thing I need to do is populate that navigation drawer with some buttons. So for the navigation drawer menu, I need to add some buttons inside of that. So the first thing I need to do is first access that navigation drawer menu itself, the actual drawer. So I'll go back into my navigation drawer namespace, call up the Syncfusion navigation drawer, and then here I will access the drawer content view. Inside of that will be my container for my buttons. In this case, because we have also downloaded the Syncfusion list view, we'll be using that as the container for the buttons. Now, there are a number of different ways you can go about doing this. You can use the native Xamarin.Forms list view. You can use a standard stack layout or a grid or something like that in order to create some buttons manually. However, we're going to use the Syncfusion list view because it will kind of help out with some of the process. It'll make some things easier once it's all set up. So once again, because I'm about to use a new control, I need to go back to the documentation, go to the list view, go to getting started, and find my getting started requirement. So I need to go down here. There are no additional steps for Android. There is an additional step for iOS again, so I need to copy this line now, the SF list view renderer. So I need to copy that, and this time it goes below that global line and above the load application line in the app delegate. So let's go back to my app, go back to the app delegate file. I'll put a space here, paste that line in, and then there should be, yep, so now we have to fix this little reference here. So we're using Syncfusion list views Xamarin.iOS or Xamarin.Forms. There we go. And now we're done with that. So now I can come back to my main page and actually go back to documentation. And now I need to find my my namespace. So in this example, you can see the namespace is called right here. This is where I get the namespace for that list view. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it into my my XAML here. Now in this case, I'm actually going to make a change to this namespace. So if you notice, the first one that I copied said navigation drawer, or gave me navigation drawer as my namespace, and that's good. But the second one, the one for the list view, gave the namespace a name of Syncfusion, and that's a little too generic. Since there are other controls here where in the documentation we also give a namespace of Syncfusion, if you have multiple namespaces of the same name, that can cause conflict. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that to SFLV, standing for Syncfusion list view. Just to make it a little bit easier to call that. So now that I have my namespace available, I can go ahead and call that component. So this will be SFLV, and then inside of that, I'll get the SF list view. And again, I'll give this a name. So I'll give this one the name of main menu. And I'm going to go ahead and create an item tapped event. I'll leave it blank for now. Well, actually, I'll go ahead and give it a name. So this is going to be called update page content. And then I will also go ahead and kind of give it some style. So I'll set up a background color, and I'll use royal blue in this case. Okay, so now I can close out that list view, and that'll get rid of the squiggles. So now we get into the fun part. So now we need to figure out how do we get buttons into our list view, and more importantly, how do we get those buttons to actually connect to other pages? And so this is where we start to deviate slightly from MVVM, because in this case, I am actually going to go into the code behind of the main page, and I'm actually going to add my buttons here. Now, it is possible to do this other ways, but in order to keep it simple for this demo, I don't want to go into custom behaviors and things like that, so I'll just keep it simple and stick with the code behind for now. It'll make sense why we do it this way once it's all put together. So let me make sure I have all my sample code here. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a container for my collection of buttons. So I'm going to use an observable collection. It's going to be of type string. Again, I'm going to keep things simple. If you want, you can of course create a model for this. You can create a custom class that can contain additional items. So for example, if you wanted your buttons to also include icons, you might want to create a custom class that includes maybe two strings, one for the name of the button and another one for a URL or something like that, that will let you navigate to a certain image, and that way you can have an icon and a label in your button. But again, I'm going to keep this simple for now, so this will just be a string collection. I'm going to call this main menu item list, and this is just going to have a getter and a setter. All right. So now inside, actually I need to fix this. So now we need to call in the object model namespace. There we go. And now in my constructor for the main page, I'm going to go ahead and give or populate that container with a new instance of that observable collection. So this will be set to a new instance of observable collection. Let's type string. There we go. So now inside of that, we're going to start to add our buttons. So for this is going to be fairly simple. So main menu item list.add, and because it's just strings, we're going to put our string in there. I'm going to copy this a few times just to give myself some space to add these buttons. About 4. So we'll have home, we'll have search, we'll have settings, and let's say help. I'm not actually going to just so you know, I'm not going to go into actually creating all of these different pages. These are just to populate the menu with some kind of some buttons. We will be creating the search page, but that's really the only one. Okay, so now we need to call we need to set the main menu dot item source. Oops. Dot items source. And we need to set that to be equal to the main menu item list. All right, so now I need to figure out why this isn't coming up. So this needs to be saved. There we go. And that should fix that. Okay. So now we have a list of buttons, and that list of buttons is now being populated into our navigation drawer content view. So if I were to run this, I should be able to see a navigation drawer with some buttons inside of it. So I'm actually going to go ahead and do that. And to make sure it works, I'm going to actually delete this line for now. So I know that's going to give me an error. So let's delete that. Save, and let's go ahead and open this up in our Android emulator. So we're going to build this app for the first time. It's going to take a little bit longer than it normally does. All right, so now it is actually loading into my emulator. So as I go along through this project, I'll also be testing this in iOS. I do also have a remote iOS simulator running, so we'll be looking at this in both Android and iOS. All right, so we've built successfully, and now we're deploying. So now we're just waiting for it to start up in the emulator. All right, so now we have a running app. So obviously everything is blank since we have not created any pages, but what we're looking for is a slide out menu. So as you can see, it does not take much code at all to create a working navigation drawer. And at this point, because this is a fully realized component, we also have access to a lot of different properties we can set to change the look and feel as well as the behavior of this navigation drawer. But for now, I'm satisfied with what we have. This is all we were trying to do, just create some menu buttons to click on. One thing to note by default, and I kind of skipped over this when setting up the navigation drawer on purpose, is that if you do not set your header and your footer height, you'll get these blank areas on the top and bottom of the navigation drawer. And so you do have the ability to set header content. So if you'd like to have something like a profile picture or something like that above or the top of your navigation drawer, you can easily do that. Same thing with the footer. If you want to have some persistent links or something like that, maybe a sign out link or something to that effect, you can easily do that as well using the footer. In this demonstration, I'm not going to be using those. So I'll go ahead and stop debugging, and I'll come here to my navigation drawer, and I will go ahead and enter in my drawer, if I can spell, drawer header height. I'll set that to 0. And I'll also do the same thing with my drawer footer height, since I will not be using those in this particular project. I'm just going to clean up the spacing here. There we go. Okay, so we have a working navigation drawer. That's great. Next thing we need to do is make these buttons actually do something. And so this is where things get a little bit more interesting in this code behind. And this is also kind of why we're not using MVVM or sticking to the MVVM design pattern strictly in this case. What we are going to do is essentially use the code behind as a view model to set up the behavior of the buttons. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go and add back that the item tapped event that I cleared earlier. So item tapped. All right, and I'm going to call that update content page. All right, now I'm going to take that and I'm going to go ahead and create that method in my code behind. And it will take a couple of parameters. So there will be an object, a sender of type object. And then we'll also be consuming the item tapped events from the Syncfusion list view. So I'll need to type in Syncfusion.listView.xforms.item tapped event args, and that'll just be E. So this is what we need in order to properly consume the item tapped events from our item tapped event inside of the list view. And at this point, we also are going to set this to void. This is not going to return anything. Okay, so what we're going to do in order to get this to work is actually utilize a simple switch statement. So we just type in switch, tap tab to use the default template. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the item tapped event arg, so that E, I'm going to get the item data that it represents, and I'm going to set that to a string, since all we're doing is getting strings from our menu items. And then I'm going to write out my cases. So case 1, oops, double clicking is not working. So case 1 will be home. And with home, I'm going to set that to just break. So there's really not going to be anything there for home. And then next up, we'll have case 2, which in this case is going to be search. And for that one, what we're going to do is we're going to set the nav drawer. So we're going to call the name of the navigation drawer itself, which was nav drawer. And from that, I want to get the drawer, I'm going to get the content view of the navigation drawer. And I'm going to set it to a new instance of a page that I haven't created yet, actually. So I'm going to call this search page. And I actually kind of jumped the gun here, but that's okay. So in my view folder, what I actually need to do is add a couple of pages. So we'll add some new items, one of them being this content page. So this page is going to be called search page. And we'll add a couple more, so we'll do another one. This one will be home. Or actually should have been home page. Next up is settings page. And then lastly, I have my my help page. And again, just a reminder, I'm not actually going to populate these pages with any content. They're just there to act as placeholders. So in each of these cases, the default content page does include a label that says welcome to Xamarin.Forms. So in this case, I'll just kind of rename each one of these to say, for example, this is the help page. So this, I'll say this is the help page, just so that we know that we are looking at the right thing when we do actually switch over to these. So home page, I'll just leave that one as welcome to Xamarin.Forms. Main page has our navigation door. Search page we are actually going to do something with. And then we have settings page. And I'll just say change your settings here. Okay. So now I can go back to that main page code behind, and you can see that my search page is coming up correctly. And now I just need to make sure that we break after that case. And so now we just need to kind of do this for the rest of the pages that we have a button for. So next up is settings. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to call it nav drawer. We're going to get its content view. And we're going to set it to a new instance of the settings page. And then we're going to break. And then finally we have our help page. So here we have help. And then we have nav drawer, content view, and new instance of help page. And break. And in the interest of, let's see, did I do something wrong there? All right, so I'll just go ahead and add the home page as I did create that. So navigation door, content page, and new instance of home. So one thing I forgot to do here, you'll notice that all of these have red squiggles. Since we are setting the content view of the navigation drawer, we cannot actually set it to an entire page. We can only set it to the content of those pages. So we need to access the content property here. So .content, and same for the rest of them. And so this specific way of implementing things, it will become a bit more interesting once we do actually need to include some more complex pages than what we have here with these placeholders. And again, that'll make more sense once we get to that point. So the last thing I want to do here in this method that for my update page content is to make sure that the navigation door closes after I tap on an item. So I want to tap into the toggle drawer method here. I'll just call that to make sure that if it's open when I tap on something, it then closes. So now let's go ahead and test this out. So we're going to run this once again in our Android emulator. And then the next time I will run it in the iOS simulator. All right, so things load a bit quicker after you've built the first time. Okay, so now we have our navigation drawer again. You can see that the header and footer that were there before are gone. Everything is kind of running up against the edges here, which we'll fix that later with some padding or some margins. But the main thing we want to look at is what happens when we click these buttons. So you can see, welcome to Xamarin.Forms, so that did change. The navigation drawer closes whenever I click on a page. Change your settings here. Yeah, I did not change the text for the search page. So yeah, so this all works. So everything is great. So now we can move on from there, and now let's actually do something a bit more complex. So what happens if the page that you want to switch to contains more than just a simple label or simple controls. What if you need to actually bind some data to a view model on the page that you need to include or switch to in your navigation drawer? So let's actually do that. Now, at this point, in the interest of time, I'm going to cheat just a little bit, and I'm going to import an API service that I created previously. So this part isn't that integral to the presentation, so I'm just going to go ahead and import this from a previous project. And I'll talk through it, but like I said, not necessarily the most important part of what we're trying to show here. So I've got a services folder that I will be importing. From my previous project. Here we go. So I will firstly need to create the folders. So there's going to be a services folder, and this is going to contain an API. And we're going to use this on the search page, and what we're going to be searching for are recipes. And so inside of that folder, I will get this service. All right, so that's in there now. And then we also will need a model in order to properly work with the data that comes back from that API. So I'll create another folder, and this will be my model folder. I'll go ahead and import that model as well. Okay, so now what we're going to do is inside of the search page, we're going to use another list view. So we're going to use a list view to kind of display the images that are coming back from that recipe API. So I'm going to get rid of the stack layout. I'm not going to, actually I am going to use it. So I'm going to keep the stack layout. I'm going to get rid of the label inside of it. And the first thing I'm going to add is a search bar. The search bar is what's actually going to activate the list view or the actual API calls to get data back and then ultimately populate the list view. So inside this search bar, we're going to have a placeholder that just says search for recipes. We're also going to have a search command. So this is actually getting slightly out of scope for what the project is meant to accomplish. So I'm not really going to talk too much about the search command or anything like that. I did do a previous webinar where I went into a little bit more detail about that. So if you'd like to check that out, it was the previous Xamarin webinar that we did. I forgot the title of it though. We'll have a link to it in the description for this one. So I'll leave that empty for now. And then we'll go ahead and set the horizontal options to start, since I want this to be left aligned essentially. And then I'm going to have a text property. So now at this point, I'm going to go and create my view model for my search page here. So this will be a new class. This will be search page view model. Inside of that, we're going to have a couple of things. And let's pull those up. So first things first, just like before, we're going to have a container for our images. So public, observable collection. This time is going to be of type hit, which comes from my model class. And I'm just going to call this recipe list. That's fine. And we're going to have a getter and a setter there as well. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and include this. So I'm going to use iNotify property changed in order to get some of this to work. So I'll go ahead and derive from that. Property changed. Make sure that's spelled correctly. Yep. And then fix that. And then one more time, we're going to implement the interface. And that can go right there. We'll also go ahead and implement object model. And then this is coming from my model folder. And since I imported this from a different application, this is going to be app 1. And so is my service. All right, and in my services, you'll also notice that I am also using I'm using Newtonsoft JSON, so I'm also going to need to import that into my or import that NuGet package. All right, so let's go ahead and do that right now. And like I said, I'm kind of breezing over this part of it because this is not the real purpose of what we're trying to do today. So the API doesn't really matter what it does or how it works. It's more about what it looks like when you need to do something more complex, like pulling data from another source and having more complex controls on your page and needing to bind to a data source through a view model. There is a special way you need to accomplish that through this navigation drawer component that we've included on that main page. All right, so now that is installed. So let's go back to my view model. And at this point, I'm just going to do some copying and pasting just because it's going to be faster. So I've got a search text string value that will contain the actual search text that's input into the search bar. So that's what that's for. The search command is what is going to actually activate when I hit the enter button or otherwise do my search. And before I paste in the next part, I need to create a constructor for this class. Oh, I just realized I spelled that wrong. That's okay. Search page view model. I'll go ahead and fix it here. Yes. Okay. Fix that as well. All right. So now, inside of this constructor, we are going to populate that recipe list just like we did before. Set my search command, and then actually bring in the search task. So I'm going to use a task since I'm doing this asynchronously. So there's a task called search images. This will call the API, populate the recipe list that I might as well just rename it. There we go. We need to implement Xamarin.Forms here. Task as well. And compiler services. All right. So now that I have my view model created for this, I can go ahead and wire these things up to my search page. I'm going to go back to the search page. And so my search command is going to be bound to the search command itself on the view model. Binding search command. And the text here, that's going to be bound to the search text that I created. I'm actually going to use self-closing tag there. Okay, clean up some of the spacing. So now we have a search bar that will activate a search command and will send over some search text. And the next thing I need to do is include a list view. And again, this is going to be a Syncfusion list view that will actually contain all that data. So first I need to copy in my namespace. So just like we did before on the main page, we need to have a namespace that calls the list view. So I'm going to paste that into the content page here. And now I can add, inside my stack layout, I can add my SFLV namespace and then get my Syncfusion list view. And we're going to call this, it doesn't really need a name at this point since we are going to be using a view model, but we'll just go ahead and give it a name, call it item list. We'll go ahead and set and this is something that's specific to the Syncfusion list view. So we have an auto fit mode for auto height when you're dealing with uneven rows. So I'll go ahead and set that to essentially be on. And we'll also bind to our item source, which is going to be that recipe list that is in the view model. So here, this is going to be a recipe list. Or actually, this needs to be binding. Okay. And so now, once again, because we're kind of doing this in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and copy in some additional code for my item template of this list view. So inside the list view, there's going to be an item template, and that's going to bind to all the different pieces of my returned items from the API. Now, this is the important part. So how do we actually get all this to work when using that navigation drawer? So typically what you would do is you would create a namespace in the XAML that would call up, for example, my view model folder, and inside of that, I would get my CLR namespace, and then it would be my app and the view model folder. And then after that, what you would do is inside of your content page, you would call that up and then get its binding context and set that to your view model. So and this was search page view model. So this is all well and good, especially if I spell it right. So view model. So this is all well and good if you're dealing with the entire page, but with the navigation drawer, we're only pulling the content of the page. So that means that we're only looking at just this code. So if you notice, that does not include that view model binding context that I just set up, and it also does not include any of these, any of my namespaces. So how does this actually work then? So what I need to do is in my main page code behind here, where I'm calling up the search page itself, I'm calling the content. All I need to do is add a second parameter that calls up the navigation drawer again. And this time I set the navigation drawer's binding context. And I set that to a new instance of the search page view model. Search page view model. And I need to make sure that comes from the right place. And that is it. There's really nothing else I need to do here. So now if I were to test this, and I'm going to do it this time in iOS, I'm going to use the iPhone X simulator. Now what should happen is I pull in the content from my search page, but I set the navigation drawer's binding context to the search page view model so that everything is still able to bind where it needs to go. So even though it's not actually pulling the view model from my search page XAML, it is still coming from it. So everything will work just as if it was pulling from the entire page, not just its content. So now we just need to wait a little bit to load in the iPhone emulator. So here we go, successfully built. And it is going to look a little funky since I did not do anything with the margins. And let's see, we've got an error naturally. So let's see, what is this? Well, I guess in the interest of time, I will just load that in the Android emulator. Alright, so now we've deployed, and let's check out what we've just done. Okay, so we have our buttons. I'm going to go over to the search page. You can see the search bar is there at the top, just as we expect. And if I were to do a search for, let's say, barbecue, as long as everything is wired up correctly, there we go, we'll get a list of items. So I didn't really do anything special with the formatting here, so you can see the images are a little bit stretched out, but it's actually pretty simple to fix that. So you can see we have a nice list of items coming in here. So that's it. That's all that's really necessary in order to get a full page with its view model to appear correctly when using the navigation drawer. So if you think about it, the work that we did in the code behind of the main page here is no different than actually using a view model for the main page. The only thing is it's in the code behind. So you're not really creating more work for yourself if you were to if you ever needed to actually add more buttons into your menu. All you would need to do is add a new menu item, give it a name, and just add the case for it in the switch statement here. And it's just that simple. So there's really not a whole lot of extra work that you've done at all. It would be the same thing if this was actually set up to be some kind of view model. And so the only thing to really be aware of is just that binding context for the navigation drawer. If you needed to include some other again, complex controls and needed to use a view model for the main page, you can still do that because we have not actually changed the binding context of the main page itself, just a navigation drawer component inside of it. So if you needed to have a main page view model with some additional backend stuff to, again, do something more complex, you're still completely able to do that because we have not touched the page's binding context. So there's still a lot of possibility with this, even set up in this manner. So what I wanted to show you next is how do you actually make this look a little bit nicer. So I have a couple of pre-built versions of this app that have come along a little bit further. But before I get into that, I also want to just quickly show you how easy it is to change the look and feel of the list view. So I'm going to paste in some code that's already kind of been done. And so it's just a couple of lines. So we're accessing the layout manager of the list view, and that allows us to go into a grid layout in order to display our items in a different manner. So in this case, I'm going to do 2 columns for any mobile device. So a phone will have 2 columns, and you can see we're using on idiom here. So with this code, we're able to customize how this displays on different devices. So phones will have 2 columns, tablets and desktop will have 4. So if I were to run this now, what we'll see is that the items and the pictures will look a lot nicer because they're laid out in a more structured manner. All right, so I go to search. I'll do a search for some pho this time. And now you can see that grid layout is implemented. So it's pretty simple to do that. So the last thing I want to do is I want to run some other versions of this app and just quickly show you the code for it once we actually do a little bit more work to make this look a little bit nicer. So this time I am going to run this in iOS. I'm going to show you the final product first, and then I'll show you some of the code that was used to create it. So one of the first things you'll notice here is that my home page is not just a blank page like it has been before. I actually do start on the search page, unlike before where I had to go here and first click on search. Now, the other thing to notice is that now that we're in iOS, we're using an iOS native search bar since we are using Xamarin.Forms. So I'll do a search for, let's say, steak. And you can see that there's a little bit of a difference in the look and feel of the list view. I have a results counter here because I've implemented a couple of things. So there's an item fade that goes on whenever a new item comes into view. You can see I've customized the actual item template a little bit. It's a little bit nicer and easier to read. And I've also utilized the auto loading feature of the list view. So you can see just now there was a little loading icon at the bottom of the list, and we're now looking at 40 results. So we've loaded in another 20 results from this search result. So if I hit the bottom again, you should see the loading icon one more time. Depending on how quickly this goes, there it goes. Now we're at 60. And so implementing all that is pretty simple. It doesn't require a whole lot more work. So let me actually bring over that particular project into view. The first thing to note is I have implemented a couple of activity indicators. So there's a built-in activity indicator in the list view itself. So I am toggling that on and off whenever I'm going through my different methods. So I have a standard method for calling my search. So my standard search will just get my recipe items. And I have a second one that is for loading more recipes. So the load more action is a separate task. And the reason for that is because when I do my standard search, I also need to clear out whatever was in the recipe list in the first place. So when I do a new search, I want to replace all the old results with whatever comes in new. And so my load more method does not have that. And also is doing some math in order to count where I am and then just add 20 to that. So some very simple math there, but still it is doing that. And then you can see here there's a separate command. So you do need to add if you are going to use the load more automatic action, you need to have a load more command. So it does need to be, or can be something separate. And then there's this can execute method as well that will simply figure out when is it appropriate to run that load more command. By default, it happens when you reach the end of the list view. So if you think about it, when you first load a list view into essentially when you initialize it, you're automatically at the end. So it is possible to kind of run into an endless loop where it's always trying to load more because it always thinks it's at the end. So this can execute method here kind of prevents that from happening. So essentially if my recipe list count is empty or if it's 0, then we're not going to run it. So only when we're essentially looking at the end of the list should it run. Another thing is, well, how did I actually get that home page to be that search page without me having to go anywhere? And that's actually pretty simple to do. Shouldn't really be that difficult to understand. So you go here, and the only thing you really need to do is just, when you initialize that, or in the constructor of the code behind, you just add your page content, and you set your binding context as well for the navigation door, or in this case, I actually did it for the page itself. Either way. All right, and that is pretty much it. That's all we have time for today. So hopefully this was a nice way for you to understand how to get started with some Syncfusion controls and to kind of get yourself a sort of template for building out something much bigger. So you can see from the example that I have running here that this is the beginnings of a bigger recipe searching app using the list view control. And just with those two controls, we have a menu. We have a menu system, we have a search system, we have this nice view with some animations and everything else. And that was just 2 of the nearly 100 controls that we have for Xamarin and the Syncfusion Xamarin library. So before we end today, I do want to talk a little bit about Syncfusion. Before I do, I want to give you a few moments to ask any questions you may have or leave comments if you haven't done so already. You can use the questions box on the right side of the screen to leave comments or questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will not be answering questions live today, but we will post the answers to all questions in our Q&A blog post along with a recording of the webinar, which will be released within the next week. Please take a few moments now to ask your questions. So Syncfusion delivers an extensive range of over 800 web, mobile, and desktop controls. We also empower businesses to get the most out of their data with our enterprise solutions, including the dashboard and big data platforms. We have been in business for over 15 years and are headquartered in the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina in the U.S. Syncfusion has more than 12,000 customers, including large financial institutions, Fortune 100 companies, and global IT consultancies. More than 1 million users from 125 countries trust Syncfusion in their development process. Let me also mention our community license. For smaller companies with revenue under $1 million US, all Syncfusion products are available for free. That includes all of the controls in Essential Studio, as well as all of our enterprise solutions and everything you saw today, all of our Xamarin controls. We have plenty of customers who have built up their businesses starting with our community license. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we will also be hosting a webinar on September 20th talking about Syncfusion's powerful dashboard platform. We will be sharing the link to join this webinar on our website and social media in the next couple of days. Speaking of which, for anyone interested in following us on social media, you can connect with us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. We make regular updates regarding what's new with Syncfusion, so feel free to leave a like, follow, and subscribe. And that marks the end of today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.